Hello and welcome to Everett Law, Ruth Farrington, and Olivia Daly's presentation on war and the environment, critiques of U.S. military strategy in the age of climate change.
As the dominant military power since the Second World War and arguably the most powerful empire in human history, analyzing the U.S. military in its current form is crucial to understanding global politics and environmental change, as its environmental impact has been critical to reaching our current state of planetary collapse.
Our main objectives are to cover the past, present, and future of the U.S. military, the scientific approaches to policy, and solutions to be incorporated into a more holistic view of national security.
Environmental impacts from violent conflicts is nothing new. While the U.S. is a relatively new nation, it's important to know how war has affected the environment through history before moving on to the United States. Before the Industrial Revolution, direct impacts on the environment were deliberate. Fire, for example, was used throughout the ancient era around the world, and most dramatic being Germanic tribes who burnt down entire forests to fight against the Romans. Like the use of fire, people also used water deprivation by diverting and damming rivers away from enemy camps to help starve them out. The Romans also used direct impacts at the end of the Third Punic War when they burnt Carthage to the ground and salted the land so that Carthage could never rise again. Hundreds of years later, the English nearly perfected chevauchés, which were a form of early scorched earth policies designed to starve the French and lure them into battle on terms favorable to the English. At the turn of the 16th century, things began to change. Europe was so deforested that timber became one of the most important resources. As an example, England created entire colonies dedicated to the timber trade in order to supply their growing navy and, by extension, their empire. New weapons also began to change the relationship between the environment and war. Small arms and artillery demanded more minerals, which demanded more mining. In war, these new weapons had more devastating effects that helped turn the battlefields into wastelands. The resources that people were looking to control was based on land. Land was a resource itself because the resources needed for war could be found in most places. The more land you had, the better you could perform in war. Around the time of the U.S. Industrial Revolution, the environmental impact of war began to change to equally direct and indirect. For example, when building defensive positions, more deforestation was required to accommodate weapons with longer ranges and to build the fortifications. Because firearms are so easy to use, developing nation-states could field a larger army and navy, which required more resources and access to those resources. Starting during the American War of Independence, George Washington used deliberate and direct environmental impacts in 1779 when he sent troops to burn down the Iroquois Confederacy, their homes, villages, towns, and fields. Decades later, the American Civil War began a faster shift on the environmental impacts of war. In 1864, General William Sherman implemented scorched earth. Similar to the medieval chevauchée, Sherman cut off his supply line and sustained his soldiers through looting as he marched through most of the state of Georgia, burning almost everything in his path. As weaponry continued to innovate, there was a growth of indirect fire. Previously, you could only hit someone with small arms and artillery if you could directly point the barrel at them. Towards the end of the Civil War, weapons like mortars were able to reach farther distances without even needing to see where you were aiming for, which helped give the rise of indirect fire, which is even more devastating to the environment. Combine this with larger manufacturing capacity, and it is easy to see how devastating these new weapons were for the environment. An interesting aspect of the Civil War and in the environmental conflict is the Lieber Code of 1863. The code was meant to give an outline of conduct for Union soldiers, and in Article 16 specifically mentions the destruction of the environment, which, quote-unquote, does not admit of the use of wanton devastation of a district. In general, military necessity does not include any act of hostility which makes the return to peace unnecessarily difficult. World War II continued to escalate direct and indirect impacts on the environment. Most people know about the effects of the nuclear weapons dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but what is not well known is the U.S.'s use of firebombing. Unlike in Germany, the U.S. promoted a much less precise bombing technique in the Pacific Theater. Firebombing was used with the intention to simply burn Japanese cities and areas to rubble, so in a sense, it is like an early version of napalm. The modern era has turned from land-based to resource-based in the resources needed for security. With the rise of capitalism, the government that owns the land is less important to the U.S. than the U.S. and the U.S.'s companies' abilities to access it. For example, in the Middle East with oil, the U.S. isn't as interested in owning the land outright as they are their access to it.
What has changed in U.S. military strategy since World War II is that the protection of oil is a fundamental principle of national security, as this resource is deemed essential to U.S. capitalism's preservation. For many decades, U.S. military spending has outpaced every country on Earth several times over. Today, the U.S. spends more than the next top 11 military spenders combined, with China as the next top spender, spending 3 times less than the U.S. Despite an overall decrease in fossil fuel use since 1975, the U.S. military is still the largest institutional consumer of petroleum and emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. In fact, if the U.S. military was its own country, it would represent the 47th largest emitter of greenhouse gases, meaning there are 148 nations that emit less than the U.S. military. 800 foreign bases located in every corner of the world. These bases create massive pollution due to waste and the dumping of hazardous materials that typically emanate from weapons testing. Even though U.S. military bases have been proven to be environmentally destructive and are now being threatened by rising sea levels, the Pentagon's response has been to urge preparations for moving bases, which would require constructing new bases in different climates. This brings us to how the U.S. military is currently framing the issue of climate change, a phenomenon that it has been a large contributor towards. In the national security field, climate change is referred to as a threat multiplier because of its potential to create new security issues and make existing ones more extreme. According to the Pentagon's 2021 Climate Adaptation Plan, the department is responding to climate change in 2 ways: adaptation to enhance resilience to the effects of climate change, and mitigation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. However, they assert that climate change adaptation must align with and support the department's warfighting requirements. What is being suggested here is maintaining the status quo. This report heavily focuses on adaptation to climate change and largely accepts the inevitability of climate change's worst effects, rather than doing more to mitigate the problem. Additionally, the report frequently references enhanced vulnerabilities to supposed adversaries of the U.S. due to climate change. While not mentioned specifically, some of the adversaries likely being referred to here are Russia and China, as they are deemed by the intelligence community to be the biggest threats to U.S. national security, rather than climate change. This resource scarcity perspective securitizes the environment by further escalating rivalry with adversaries and guaranteeing militaristic conflict over resources. Seeing environmental degradation solely as a national security threat rather than an international security threat aligns with the concept of military metaphysics, which offers the perspective that every international issue has a military solution. This type of thinking is so pervasive among the U.S. elite because war-making is extremely profitable. Despite the massive amounts of environmental, political, economic, and social destruction just one nation's military can cause, military emissions have been left out of international climate agreements for decades now, starting with the Kyoto Protocol of 1998, the Paris Climate Accords in 2015, and now at COP26. These emissions are going unmentioned in negotiations. Nevertheless, NGOs and activists are pushing for this topic to be put on the agenda. Despite my cynicism on this issue, we will be including links to a petition and more information below our video. In conclusion to this section, the U.S. military approach to climate change today demonstrates the need to challenge the mainstream meaning of national security and to modify the nation-state-centric concept of modern international affairs in order to focus on transnational issues.
With rising sea levels, U.S. shores will only be more defensible than they already are. Flooded cities would make a naval landing even more difficult, since landing ships would have to maneuver in and around flooded cities, and the U.S.'s Air Force would only serve to keep aerial drops to a minimum. However, depending on what floods and where, it could present a danger to U.S. military bases on the coast, which would have to be rebuilt in other places. Another aspect in the future of war is increasingly dangerous and unpredictable storms. This would make responses to immediate threats very dangerous if there's a storm that could put pilots in danger. One way to counter this would be to train and deploy more Air Force Special Tactics units in order to better understand current weather in combat zones. In addition, the U.S. will need to rely more on the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's uniformed corps in order to better predict and prepare for weather patterns, and it will need to provide better training for the Coast Guard as well. It will be important for the U.S. to determine, while climate change is happening and as sea levels actively rise, where to build new military bases and how permanent they want them to be. However, it's not just sea levels, it is also the heat as well. Soldiers fight outside, which means they will be more susceptible to heat and will require more water, which is set to become scarcer in general. The executive branch will have to ask themselves who should get this water, the people or the soldiers defending the people. Besides the on-the-ground military strategy, the U.S.'s supply capabilities, relations regarding supplies like oil and the 3 Ts, and how the U.S. conducts itself overseas will probably have to be revisited as climate change changes the global political landscape. Finally, the U.S. will have to think about all of these things in order to adapt to new battlefields such as the Arctic.
Based off of our research, the policy recommendations we found dealt with increasing funding of critical science analysis and a rebooting of the national security doctrine and architecture to include socio-ecological systems for a changing planet. The following are some of the ways we think that this could be effectively implemented as a national security issue in the U.S. government. It would be beneficial to pause and read through each of these points at a future time. Amplifying ecological and national security issues in the United States government by creating an Office of Environmental Security and integrating the ecological security into the intelligence curriculum. Initiating an ecological and national security research agenda will help deepen our understanding between the ecological disruptions and security that is happening in a timescale, but also in our future. We also think that promoting the methods that protect and expand critical systems and services will be beneficial for future generations in understanding and implementing solutions to a changing planet. Also, building and strengthening an international alliance will deepen the ecological leadership of the U.S. Also, engaging the public on ecological and natural security issues by deploying effective advocates, primarily Indigenous advocates, who are focused on long-term preservation goals. Thank you for listening to our presentation on war and environment. We will leave you with this quote that reminds us what is at stake and the importance of bringing real scientific solutions to our current international crisis. The concept of saving the planet through environmental policy and protection is misleading. Earth's system operates on timescales of millions of years, and the planet will continue to exist long after people are gone. What is at stake is the trajectory of organized human civilization. Thank you.